Do psychiatry drugs kill? What do you think? Do we need pills for treating mental illnesses? What is that? What are mental illnesses? Can we trust in psychiatry research? Do we must abolish psychiatry? What do you think? What do you think? Well, sorry for my English, but today we have in enGrama Peter Gøtzsche, a doctor and researcher in biology who spent many of his years at Cochrane, from where he came out with problems, and who has written many controversial works, for which today we are going to ask him. And before beginning, we have to tell you that YouTube censored us and dropped the interview when we did it. But luckily, we have been able to recover it, although with lower image and sound quality. But we recovered it. Yes, we recovered it. Haha. Why did YouTube do that? I don't know. Cuéntamelo, niño. Well, maybe yes, maybe I know. And then, in the interview, you will see it.
¿Estás preparada para desarrollar tu espíritu científico? Bienvenida a la primera formación online de enGrama, con Esteve, Freixa y Baqué, grabada, 100% presencial, más de 7 horas, PDFs y artículos, con certificado acreditado por el CIENTÍFICA. Nutrirás la manera en que percibes el mundo. ¿Cómo ser la primera en adquirirlo? Descúbrelo en la web de enGrama. Únete, regístrate ahora.
So we have here Dr. Gøtzsche, Peter Gøtzsche. First of all, as we always do, we want you to introduce yourself, tell us about your career, your program, your projects, and all of that.
Well, I'm both a biologist and a doctor. I have 2 educations. And I'm a specialist in internal medicine, but have worked in many different areas. I have done a lot of research. Someone found out recently that I'm the most cited of all Cochrane researchers, every one of them. And I co-founded the Cochrane collaboration in 1993, where we write systematic reviews about the benefits and harms of drugs and surgery and other healthcare interventions. And then I became a professor and did only research for the last 25 years of my career.
Okay, so lately you have focused on psychiatry, right?
Yes.
Why do you focus your research on psychiatry?
Because a person I knew came to me and asked if she could do a PhD with me. And she wanted to compare the newer depression pills with sleeping pills, anxiety pills, usually called benzodiazepines, because she wondered if history was repeating itself. And it surely did. It took more than 20 years before the authorities admitted that you become addicted to benzodiazepines and that you can get terrible withdrawal symptoms if you try to stop. And it can be very difficult to come off benzodiazepines. The drug industry and psychiatrists whom they corrupted by money denied for decades that the newer depression pills could also make people dependent. But what my PhD student and I found out was that the abstinence symptoms when you suddenly stop are virtually the same on benzodiazepines and newer depression pills, often called happy pills, although they don't make people happy. Quite the contrary. They destroy people's sex lives in about half of those who go on them. Which a Spanish researcher, by the way, did a wonderful article about. We showed that the denial in psychiatry, that people deny the facts, is horrible and it is harmful for the patients. So even since then, I have studied psychiatry because I quickly found out that it is the worst of all medical disciplines. I have documented in my books and scientific articles that psychiatry does more harm than good. So it should simply be abolished. It should be stopped because the psychiatrists, they use drugs far too much, and these psychiatric drugs, they don't really help people, but they make it more difficult for them to come back to a normal life.
Great. And psychology, do you think is necessary for our society, or we can abolish it?
What do you mean?
The discipline of psychology, do you think that we need in our society that work, that job, or we can abolish all that?
No, now you talk about psychology. This is very different to psychiatry.
Yes. You have talked about.
We need to abolish psychiatry.
Yes.
And
yes,
one of my colleagues, who is a psychiatrist, he has said that the worst error you can make in your life can very likely be if you have a psychological problem and you decide to look up a psychiatrist. This is far too dangerous for you. You should not do that. You should look up a psychologist, or you should look up a psychiatrist who doesn't use psychiatric drugs. There are very few of these, but there are some psychiatrists that only use psychotherapy. And psychotherapy works. My daughter, who is a psychologist, and we have documented that psychotherapy halves the risk of a new suicide attempt among people who have been admitted with a suicide attempt. So they are of high risk of committing another suicide attempt. And psychotherapy halves that risk. And what we fear more than anything else if people are depressed is that they kill themselves. So what do the pills do? They double the risk of a suicide, not only in children, which we have known for a long time, but also in adults. So it makes absolutely no sense that these depression pills are so widely used as they are, because they drive some people into suicide because of their harms.
So, can we trust in psychiatry research? Which are the main problems of that research?
Pardon, I did not understand it.
That if we can trust in psychiatric research, and which are the main problems in that research?
Psychiatric research is generally highly unreliable. I and others have documented this in scientific articles and books. For example, drug trials are organized by the drug industry, and they analyze the data, and you don't get access to the data, so you can analyze them yourself. And it has been documented many times that this data analysis is biased. So scientific articles on psychiatric drugs give you a wrong impression about what these drugs do to people, and very often harms have been eliminated from the manuscripts. Not only minor harms, but even death have been removed. There is a big review that showed that half of all deaths and half of all suicides in psychiatric drug trials, they simply disappear before the trials get published. This is one reason why doctors don't know how dangerous these drugs are.
Mm-hmm. And what are the main myths in psychiatry? Like this chemical imbalance causes mental illness, or drug treats these chemical imbalances?
This is one of the biggest lies in psychiatry about the chemical imbalance. When people become depressed, it is almost always because they live a depressing life. For example, there was a patient who went to a psychiatrist, and then the psychiatrist said, "Oh, I want to prescribe to you depression pills." And then the patient got angry and said, "I don't need depression pills, I need a job."
Yes.
So that was why he was sad and depressed. So it is totally wrong to say that you are depressed because you have a chemical imbalance in your brain. This turns the attention to you and not to your living conditions. The problem is yours alone because something is wrong with your brain. This is totally, utterly wrong. There has been a lot of research into this, and none of it has ever documented that you become depressed or psychotic or get a diagnosis of ADHD because there is something wrong with your brain. You have a chemical imbalance. And it is a very harmful lie, because when patients think there is something wrong with their brain, and when they are sometimes told by their psychiatrist, this is like having diabetes and you need insulin, so then they won't stop with their drug. It will be difficult for them to stop because then they think everything will come back.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
so many patients go on for a lifetime on these harmful drugs.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, this is one of the main topics that when you debate with psychiatrists, they bring, like these psychiatric drugs are necessary for acute episodes in psychosis, for example, or long-term treatment prevent relapses, right? So what can you tell us about that?
But these things are totally wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Psychosis pills, I don't call them antipsychotics, which is their usual name, because they don't really work for psychosis. Mm-hmm. What they do is that they knock you down so that you have difficulty doing anything. Just to read a book or live a normal life becomes difficult. So their original name was major tranquilizers. Mm-hmm. And this is really what they do. They knock you down. And they don't have any specific effect on psychosis. They work in the same way on you if you take them, or on animals. And they make it more difficult for people to ever come back to a normal life. So I know several psychiatrists who never use psychosis pills. They use psychotherapy, and psychotherapy has been shown to be effective in psychosis. And above all, what is most important if people have a psychosis is to use a lot of time to find out not the standard question, what is wrong with you, but what happened to you? This is the question. Because if you talk carefully to the patient, you might find out that the psychosis actually started with anxiety when they were teenagers and went to school. And this anxiety then developed more and more. And if you cannot cope with strong anxiety, you might end up becoming psychotic. And above all, it has been shown that people who become psychotic, they have very often been subjected to severe trauma. For example, rape or other physical abuse in the home or elsewhere. So the more traumas a patient has experienced, the greater the risk of later developing a psychosis. So sometimes you can actually cure people by working with them and finding out that 10 years ago they were raped and they never became normal after that. So if you start working with that on psychotherapy, you can actually heal some patients so that they will never become psychotic again.
Mm-hmm. And what can you tell us about the other, I think, big topic in this theme that is electroshock? Is it harmful? It isn't, because I have heard psychiatrists defend that, no, that it isn't harmful, that is effective.
In my view, electroshock should be forbidden. It should be banned. No one should get an electroshock. I just had a problem with my computer before this interview. Would you really suggest that I sent electric current through the computer and then hope that it became well? I don't think you would suggest that. And electroshock is pretty harmful. Quite many patients get their memories permanently disturbed, and some people die. There are various estimates, but it's around 1 per 1,000 who are killed by electroshock. And the effect is so poor that you repeat the electroshocks. So the record I have heard was an Afro-American who received more than 500 electroshocks. This is absolutely crazy. And when something doesn't work, this is actually a definition of insanity, that you do the same thing over and over. When you have experienced it doesn't work, then you give more of the same. This is what psychiatrists do all the time with electroshock and with their drugs. If a psychosis pill doesn't work, you increase the dose. And what does that mean? It means you increases the risk of killing your patient or causing permanent brain damage, because this is dose related. But it doesn't increase the chance of an effect. This has been shown in several studies. So all over psychiatry, people are doing the wrong things. And there is a lot of good research about electroshock, but the psychiatrists deny this completely. And they continue to say that electroshock can be life-saving. I have often asked psychiatrists, where can I see the documentation that electroshock has been life-saving? They don't have any. And once I was asked at a meeting what my opinion was of a woman who was deeply depressed, and then she got an electroshock, and then she suddenly asked for a cup of coffee. Well, I responded that I once received a man when I was on acute duty at the hospital. I could not contact him, so I needed to rule out meningitis because this is very dangerous. So I tried to insert a needle in his back in order to get some fluid out of the spinal channel to study this fluid for bacteria and protein and glucose and so on. And I couldn't get in really. So I tried the needle several times, and the man was totally unconscious. And then suddenly he shouted, stop hurting me with this damned needle. So then I realized he did not have meningitis, really. So did I cure him with my needle? No, I didn't. But it's an anecdote that is similar to the woman who asked for a cup of coffee. You don't practice medicine based on anecdotes. You practice medicine based on science. But this is not what the psychiatrists do. They ignore the most reliable science they have.
Mm-hmm. So with all of these controversies, or maybe I have to say lies, where does it all come from? What is the role of drug industry in psychiatry?
Well, you will be surprised. There is a huge amount of money involved with cancer treatment. Newer cancer treatments, they sometimes cost millions for just one patient. The same in cardiology. Many procedures in cardiology are highly expensive. Many drugs are very expensive. So these doctors receive a lot of money from the drug industry because they buy them. They buy their opinions. They buy their loyalty. Now, you will be surprised to hear that no specialty receives more money than psychiatry. It is really incredible.
Mm-hmm. And why? Why do you think it is this way?
Of course, money rules the world, not only in America, but also in the rest of the world. And with money, you can obtain almost anything you want.
Mm-hmm. And which are the worst practices you have seen or known in the psychiatric drug industry? And why do we use drugs for treating people if they don't cure? They only attenuate the symptoms.
Well, the whole specialty is totally rotten. So there is no chance of reforming psychiatry. You can't do that because the people who are at the top in psychiatry, they see it to their own advantage to let it be as it is. And if you're a junior psychiatry in training and you don't repeat all the lies and wrong ideas that your seniors have, you won't have a good career in front of you. So they get indoctrinated. And after some years, they forgot their criticism and they become like the rest of them. So if you have a rotten house, it doesn't really help to call for people to repair the house. You need to tear it down and build a new one. This is where we are with psychiatry. The whole specialty is so totally rotten that it should be stopped.
Do you think that the psychological problems, the mental illnesses, are an invention of the human being?
That is an easy question. There are people, actually all of us, will face difficulties in life. Life is not easy. And if these difficulties become too overwhelming, you can somehow collapse. You can become anxious, you can become psychotic, you can become depressed, you can become almost anything. So, of course, there are problems. But the next question is, are diagnoses reliable in psychiatry? They are not. When you have asked the same psychiatrist to see the same patients independently, they disagree very much about the diagnosis. So the diagnoses are highly unreliable. And many people call schizophrenic, for example, when they are seen by other psychiatrists, they conclude that they have never had schizophrenia. The diagnoses are a big problem, and where you can see this most clearly, perhaps, is for the diagnosis called ADHD.
Yes.
When I lecture for patients and one of them suddenly says, I have ADHD, then I say, no, you cannot have ADHD because it doesn't exist. You can have a dog or a boyfriend or a car, but you cannot have ADHD. It is not something in nature like an elephant. It doesn't exist. It's just a name for people who are more active than other people and less easily disturbed, perhaps. It is just one end of a normal spectrum. At the other end of a normal spectrum, you have people who are too quiet. So when I lectured, I usually joked about when will we get a diagnosis for those at the other end of the normal spectrum. And then we got the diagnosis. This is called attention deficit syndrome without hyperactivity. They are just too quiet. So now my joke is, when will we get a diagnosis for people in the middle so that the drug industry can make sure that everybody gets treated for ADHD or some other letter combination? I have used the adult ADHD test many times when I lecture, both for psychologists and for lay people and so on. And between 1/3 and 1/2 of normal people test positive for the adult ADHD test. When I tried it on my wife, who is a very energetic woman, she scored 6 out of 6, a full house. You just need a score of 4 to get the diagnosis. So I tried it on myself. I scored 5. Then we were visited by our youngest daughter. We tried her. She scored 5. Her boyfriend is a totally laid-back man whom you would never expect to score positive. He scored 4. So we were 4 people at the dinner table who all qualified for an adult ADHD diagnosis. It can hardly be more insane than this. And then people get treated with drugs that, if you buy them in the street, they are considered illegal. They are amphetamine or amphetamine-like products. But if you get them on a prescription, things seem to be okay. This world is insane. I'm sorry, but psychiatry is the worst example I can imagine.
Our conception about psychological problems, mental illnesses, is that the illness is in the system, is in the society, but not in the person. And I would like to go in deep in the. What do you think about the addiction that provokes some of the medical drugs?
What I think about addiction?
The addiction that provokes the drugs, the pills, the psychiatric pills.
I didn't understand the question.
What about that addiction that can cause the pills, the drugs that we use in psychiatry?
Oh, it's the other way around. You mean the pills cause addiction?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Everything that changes the brain makes it more or less difficult to stop again. If you abuse alcohol or opium or heroin or whatever, anything that changes the brain runs the risk of making you addicted, which means you cannot stop from one day to the other. You need to withdraw very slowly. And psychiatrists I have talked to have told me that psychiatric drugs are actually much more hard to stop than heroin, because to stop heroin is not that difficult. You can do it relatively quickly, but that's not the case with psychiatric drugs. It can take years to stop psychiatric drugs, and for some people, it is just impossible. The brain has changed so much that they cannot endure the abstinence symptoms, even though they try to lower the dose very slowly over many months.
Okay. And do you think, is it possible that we can achieve a system in which we leave behind all this over-pathologization and over-medication of human behavior? Do you think it's possible to arrive to that system?
I have tried to make people aware for over 15 years how harmful psychiatry and psychiatric drugs are. And I have given numerous lectures all over the world, and I'm a member of, for example, Critical Psychiatry Network based in the UK, where most people are psychiatrists, but they are critical towards their specialty, and they want to change it in a more humane direction with very little use of drugs. But we don't have any chance because there is so much propaganda from the drug industry and from psychiatric associations and from patient associations, which are often supported financially by the drug industry. So there is so much propaganda that the politicians hear about all the time that you don't have any chance of creating a kind of humane psychiatry. It just won't happen. I'm sorry, but it's absolutely horrible.
Okay.
Sorry, I was mute. I know you answered this question on your book about on critical psychiatry, but I think the suggestions that you give at the end of the book are really interesting for the people. So the question is there any future for psychiatry?
I have written several books about psychiatry. Which one are you talking about?
I'm talking about critical psychiatry textbook.
Okay. I published this myself this summer in July. I read the 5 most commonly used psychiatric textbooks in Denmark. They are used by medical students, by students of psychology and psychiatry. And I found so many errors in these books that I wrote my own book, which is more honest, where I point out what is wrong with these textbooks. And it's the same all over the world. And then I gave some recommendations in the back. But the most important one is that psychiatry should be abolished. So which other things are you thinking of?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. For example, I also have a suggestion that in the meantime, before psychiatry gets abolished, which will never happen, those in charge of psychiatry should not be psychiatrists, because it's too dangerous for the patients, it should be psychologists who are not in favor of psychiatric drugs, because some psychologists try to behave like psychiatrists, and this gives them prestige. And so they are positive to psychiatric drugs. But we really need psychiatry to be run by social workers and psychologists that are not positive to psychiatric drugs. This should happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we psychologists, and this is a conflict of interest, a declaration of conflict of interest, because I'm a clinical psychologist. We feel we have to prove we are effective playing other game, like playing with psychiatrist rules, because we have to fit in all of that biomedical construction of mental illness. And we, at least some of us, are critical with this conception. We don't focus on brain that have to change, but on a person and his behaviors, emotions, and thoughts, and the role of his relationship with his environment. So the question is, what do you think it could be the role of we clinical psychologists, which is what you have talked a bit about, and in this job of changing all of these psychiatric practices, and how we psychologists can do better in this job?
Well, good psychologists are already doing pretty well, because they know the importance of talking to people and listening to them and finding out what happened to them in the past. This is so vital for psychiatric patients to be heard and understood. So I think you're already doing quite well. Before this interview, you wrote to me that there are also problems with psychological research. And this is, of course, true, that some studies of psychotherapy are also biased. For example, because the examiner of the effect is not blinded, but knows whether the patient got psychotherapy or just some kind of usual talk and caring. But even so, it is obvious that psychological therapy can be effective, and it doesn't kill people, which psychiatric drugs do. In my book from 2015, I tried to work out how many people are killed by psychiatric drugs. So I studied the randomized trials, and I studied good observational studies where people with and without drug usage were being compared. And I came up with a devastating result. Namely, that psychiatric drugs are so harmful that they may be the third leading cause of death after heart disease and cancer. And I'm fully aware that this estimate might be exaggerated, but I went to the best research I could find. And even though it's not the third leading cause of death, it might be the fourth or the fifth leading cause of death. And this is very, very bad for drugs that don't really help people, but make it more difficult for them to live a normal life.
Mm-hmm.
So there are so many good reasons why we should not use these drugs, apart from very acute situations where a patient is totally deranged and cannot sleep and has a terrible time. But then we don't need psychosis pills. We can just use benzodiazepines, which are not so dangerous. And they even seem to work better in an acutely disturbed situation.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, these drugs are very cheap. So you will have difficulty finding any psychiatrist or drug industry, not any drug company, that will recommend these drugs instead of psychosis pills.
Mm-hmm. And now changing with the topic, I want you to tell us more about one of your projects, the Institute for Scientific Freedom. What are its objectives and its principles? And if you want, you can tell us what happened with Cochrane and conflicts of interest and all of that things that maybe, I don't know, have led you to initiate this project.
What I did in my work in psychiatry was perceived as quite threatening for mainstream psychiatry. So people went after me. They complained to the Cochrane leadership about me, even though the complaints had absolutely no merit. Unfortunately, Cochrane at that time had a CEO who did not understand what science and scientific freedom and our values are about. When we started Cochrane in 1993, where I was one of the founders. So instead, he organized a show trial against me after the Russian way, like Stalin did. And they asked a lawyer to go through what I had done for the last 15 years. And although they paid the lawyer to find some dirt on me, he actually exonerated me. He said that there was no reason, I hadn't done anything really wrong. But it didn't matter because it was a show trial. And then they invented all sorts of rumors about me. And the official excuse was bad behavior. I mean, what is bad behavior? The patients loved what I was doing. Cochrane was built in order to benefit patients. And I was the most visible person in Cochrane. So by expelling me, they scored a huge own goal. As soon as I had been expelled, I was told when I gave lectures around the world that people had lost confidence in Cochrane because they had kicked out the person who was a symbol of honesty and scientific integrity and science at a very high level. So it was very, very bad what they did. And Cochrane is in a very bad shape today. Now this man who did all that, he suddenly disappeared in the middle of a month. Very, very strange. But at the same time that the major funder of Cochrane, the National Health Service in the UK, had declared that now they would cut funding considerably because they were dissatisfied with Cochrane for the same reasons as I was. So it was a huge tragedy. That's what I can say about Cochrane. It's going rapidly downhill.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for me, it was personally shocking because at the same time, I knew your work about this book, Psychiatric Denial, and your job at Cochrane. I was studying my degree in psychology, so I was studying these reviews in these Cochrane reviews. So for me, it was really shocking. And how can we trust the research, not only Cochrane, but other big institutions?
Well, sorry. You cannot trust Cochrane reviews on psychiatric drugs because by far most of these trials are highly flawed. There has not been a sufficient blinding because these drugs give people side effects. So when you compare them with placebo, the psychiatrist has often guessed who gets active drug and who gets placebo. And it is the psychiatrist or their assistants who decide whether you have become better on some subjective scale. Mm-hmm. If you put something in the placebo that also gives people side effects, then the effect is much smaller. In depression, for example. And there is another reason why Cochrane reviews are not reliable. And that is that in almost all trials, you take people who are already on a psychiatric drug. Then you randomize them to placebo or to another such drug, which means that you cause a cold turkey in the placebo group in many patients. They get abstinence symptoms. And some of these symptoms are the same as the disease you are trying to treat. And then you say, aha, now people get more depressed or more psychotic when they come on placebo, but these are abstinence symptoms. I mean, it is so totally biased. So now I have mentioned just two of the problems in psychiatric drug trials. And people who do Cochrane reviews, they are not critical enough. They accept many of these trials on face value.
Mm-hmm. This reminds me something that I have read in your book, in one of your books, that is that sometimes people receive these psychiatric drugs and they then, because of the effects, they mimic another diagnosis. So they receive more drugs. Can you explain how this works?
Oh, sorry. I just put on the light. That was not a good idea. Now, yes, I discussed this with a professor of psychiatry once. I told him that the side effects of Ritalin and other ADHD drugs are very similar to the criteria psychiatrists use when they come up with a diagnosis of bipolar. And then I said, since the symptoms are the same, how can you say that it is now a second diagnosis and not just side effects? Mm-hmm. And to my big surprise, he said, I can, because I'm a psychiatrist. Then I gave up. I mean, they are even brainwashing themselves. Mm-hmm. It's absolutely horrible. And we have seen the diagnosis bipolar in children, which was almost totally unknown 30 years ago. It has exploded, particularly in America, after they invented the diagnosis ADHD and started using stimulants. So this is a huge disaster, because bipolar is treated with dangerous drugs like lithium, psychosis pills, antiepileptics, and antiepileptics actually double the risk of suicide.
Mm-hmm. And now I want to know more about these values that you put in the Institute for Scientific Freedom, and tell us, please, more about this project.
Well, the psychiatrist, one of the psychiatrists who never uses drugs or electroshock, he told me when Cochrane had kicked me out that now we need to make an institute for you where you can continue your work. So he was very active helping me to set up the institute. And the values are, of course, that all science must be published, all results must be published, also the death in psychiatric research. And of course, you need to be completely honest. I mean, these are very simple values, but they are not so common in healthcare research, where there are so many incentives to be dishonest. It improves your career possibilities.
Mm-hmm. And for professionals, I think that it may be shocking to hear these things for a lot of psychiatrists. So I want you to tell us, where can people see documentation about all of these, where they can find your books, your works, the research, the main research that it's backing up all of these affirmations?
It's all over the place. We don't need any more research. We already know the answer. I have written some books, and a famous science journalist, Robert Whittaker in America, wrote 2 books, Mad in America, and then next he wrote Anatomy of an Epidemic, namely an epidemic of overdiagnosis and overtreatment, which means in all countries where this has been examined, the more you use psychiatric drugs, the more people get on disability pension. They cannot work. So this also shows how disastrous psychiatry is. And then we have good psychiatrists that have written good books, like Joanna Moncrief, David Healy, Peter Breggin, Jock McLaren in Australia. There are actually a number of good psychiatrists who have documented what we need to know, both in scientific articles and in their books. We have everything we need in order to conclude psychiatry must be abolished.
Mm-hmm.
But as you know, the world is not like that.
Mm-hmm. And how we as professionals can we know if this is a good research, if there is information that is being hide and that kind of things, how we can be more literate?
That's very easy. Those of us who have written these books, we have also documented what is wrong with the science that mainstream psychiatry refers to. So you have that documentation as well. So it's not a question about whether to believe us or the other side, because we have documented what is wrong. It's very simple. You cannot escape that or run away from it. For example, many psychiatrists have written articles where they say that psychosis pills lower mortality. These are some of the most harmful and dangerous drugs ever invented. I have documented, based on randomized trials, that these drugs double mortality in people who are treated with them. They don't lower mortality, but psychiatrists are willing to do very poor research with a lot of bias where they claim the opposite. But it's very easy to show the bias. But in the psychiatric world, it doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. People just won't listen.
Mm-hmm. And I know that in your website, the Institute for Scientific Freedom website, you can download most of your works, a lot of books, and they are free to download. So
I have actually recently provided 2 of my books for free in Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
The psychiatry book from 2015 and my book about organized crime in the drug industry from 2013. Mm-hmm. And the reason I offer them for free is that My Spanish publisher is a thief. He steals the royalty he owes me. He refuses to pay my royalty, and he has done that to other people. And he has refused to pay translators and so on. But my contract with him has expired. So I can do what I want. So I have made the 2 books available for free.
Right.
So my Spanish publisher is a crook.
Well, let everybody go and download those books and not buy them. I bought it. I have it. But, well, it's too late. Yeah, we have it. But I want you to explain, to tell us about what's your opinion about how science it's construct nowadays with publications and payments of researches.
Warning! Din don din! We have silenced this part because YouTube previously censored us and deleted the video because of Peter's statements about COVID and the pandemic. Así que muchísimas gracias, YouTube majo. Bueno, podéis aprovechar este momento para ir a la cajita de comentarios y dejarnos vuestras hipótesis, vuestras cábalas acerca de qué es lo que ha podido decir nuestro amigo Picha. ¿Qué es lo que ha podido decir Pedro? No lo sabemos. ¿Qué es lo que opináis? Nada más. Hasta luego.
And what do you recommend for the people that is suffering this psychiatric violence?
They should try to stay away from psychiatry. And this can be difficult because psychiatry also has forced admission and forced treatment. And I agree with the United Nations rapporteur about psychiatry that forced treatment in psychiatry is a human rights violation that must be abolished. But it hasn't been abolished in any country.
So if they want, for example, to stop taking his drugs and that kind of things, what they can do, are they organizations or something like that help them to take that step?
Well, it can be very difficult. The worst example I have heard of is a family that fled from America to Canada to avoid forced drugging, because USA is perhaps worse than any other country. So they escaped the tyranny of psychiatry by moving country. And I just cannot understand how we can have such an inhumane system that forces people to take drugs that double their risk of dying and which create permanent brain damage in the vast majority that gets treated for quite some years, which many of them do. They develop tardive dyskinesia where they cannot control their movements, for example, which is a horrible condition and a sign of permanent brain damage. It is so inhumane that I cannot figure out how we can live with this system in our time. So I often think of the Middle Ages and how they treated people at that time.
Now that you are speaking about that, I think it's important to talk a bit more about it, because maybe people that are hearing us, they can conceive this forced treatment. So what can you tell us about that thing that happened to these people?
Well, they get destroyed because psychosis pills are harmful. It's very simple.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, I have this angina problem. It's coming up again.
No problem. And I have just a last more question. That is, can you tell us about other projects that you have now, or things that you are working on, or you want to develop?
Yes, I am. I'm involved in a project with my co-director where we look at long-term harms and serious harms of the COVID-19 vaccines.
We have silenced this part because YouTube previously censored us and deleted the video because of Peter's statements about COVID and the pandemic.
Okay,
so yes, this is all, Peter. If you want, you can leave a last message for our audience, and that's it.
Well, my main message is use drugs as little as possible. Our prescription drugs are clearly the third major cause of death after heart disease and cancer. And many of the drugs people take, like ibuprofen for back pain or headache or whatever, they're actually too dangerous. These drugs can give you heart attacks and bleeding stomach ulcers that kill you if you are unlucky. So in general, my best advice is think twice before you go to the pharmacy with a prescription you get from your doctor. Go on the internet, read the package inserts to find out about all the harms that your doctor might not have told you about. Then you might decide that maybe you don't need the drug. Maybe it wasn't that bad with your pain, for example.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so thank you so much for being here with us and for this conversation and for your time.
You are most welcome. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.